we're going to go ahead and get started with our first installment of the Greenhouse Grower Executive Series. So welcome everybody. The series is a continuing conversation about business practices in the green industry that foster success. And I'm your co-host and editor of Greenhouse Grower, Wendy Probst, and I'm joined with my fellow host, Greenhouse Growers Managing Editor, Julie Hewlett.
Hi, everybody. Again, thank you for joining us today. I'm sure that I've seen some of you out and about at industry events, probably most recently at Cultivate. I hope that we also have some new industry faces with us today. If you haven't been to one of Greenhouse Growers' webinars, please keep an eye out in the future. We're planning on doing a lot more, and we hope that you can join us. So this particular series is called the Greenhouse Grower Executive Series. These conversations will take place every other month to feature various aspects of your business. Each installment is intended to be a thought-provoking, action-oriented conversation at the executive level to discuss your top business needs. If you have ideas for future webinar topics, please send me an email. I'd be happy to hear from you. We're always looking to hear from our audience members and hear about what you'd like to learn about. So I will drop my email address in the chat in a moment. If you have any questions during the webinar, we do ask that you type them into the Q&A box on your Zoom screen, and we will address all questions in the last 10 minutes of the webinar. It will be recorded and available on greenhousegrower.com. And if you are having any trouble hearing the webinar, please just try logging out and clicking on that Zoom link again to join. And hopefully, that'll solve whatever audio challenges you have. If not, again, feel free to throw a message in the chat and we will try to get that worked out for you.
Okay, thanks, Julie. So in this installment, we'll be discussing the nuances of building an effective forecast with Hoffman Nursery's Chief Operating Officer, David Hoffman, and Michigan State University's Farm Business Management Educator. I hope I got that right, Jon LaPorte. David, let's start with you. Can you give us a little bit of background about Hoffman Nursery and your overall vision as a successful ornamental grass company?
Yeah, thank you both for having us today. So we're an ornamental grass grower specializing in young plants for the nursery trade. Probably, I guess, about half of our business goes to nurseries and other growers. So whether those plants end up in the landscapes, whether they're going to big box stores, or eventually IGCs, that's probably half of the business. And then the other half is roughly mostly landscapers. So folks that are taking our plants and putting them directly into the landscape. So we do about 140 different grasses and sedges and rushes. And again, sort of all different parts of the industry. Our main focus and sort of where we're looking more into the future with is green infrastructure. So think bioswales, rain gardens, restoration type projects. We see a lot of opportunity there, especially when you start talking about water and clean water and a lot of the, I guess, recent rain events that have been happening, and they're increasing volumes and being able to mitigate some of those issues in floodplains, trying to make sure that people are staying safe and those types of things. Between health and safety, there's a lot of, I think, opportunity there for plants to be able to be part of the problem, or excuse me, part of the solution.
I got what you were saying.
Yeah, good. Thank you.
Thanks, David. Jon, can you tell us a little bit about your work as a farm business management educator at Michigan State?
Sure can. So my role is a little bit unique in agriculture, at least in terms of the way that we kind of have things structured within MSU Extension. We have a number of teams that focus kind of in production areas. So we have actually educators that work in like greenhouse and nursery areas. We have some that work in field crops or dairy or beef. My job as a farm business management educator is I kind of dabble in a little bit of all of those because I focus more on the actual the business and financial side of the equation for farm and ranch type businesses. So as you think about developing a business planning, looking into developing financial information, possibly looking into getting loans or other types of financial assistance, better understanding the farm business, trying to think through analyzing from a financial standpoint, how is the farm doing, and then connecting that back in a lot of ways to the production size of the operation. It's kind of a lot of what I work into. I focus a lot on helping people to really try to better understand their business, looking at cost of production, looking at how to better market what they're trying to sell, and really looking over how do you grow the business overall. And I spend a lot of time trying to kind of bridge the connection, I often say, between production and the financial or the economic side, because a lot of cases people think that those are really separate, but they're so intertwined in the business world. And so I work a lot in that area, and also do a lot of work around what we call beginning farmers. Kind of use the USDA term for that. So anyone who's been managing a business for less than 10 years, try to provide some help in terms of thinking through strategies and getting their business not only started, but also continuing to grow and improve and hopefully sustain that business over time. And so I dabble a little bit of everything when it comes to financial and business side of things. It gets me into conversations like this, or I don't necessarily have a greenhouse background myself, but I've been learning a lot over the last couple of years, and my fellow educators that work in greenhouse and nurseries continue to help educate me. And so looking forward to adding what I can to this discussion today.
Okay, thanks, Tom. So because we're covering forecasting, let's get started with David. David, what are your primary considerations when creating a forecast from year to year?
Thanks. So I think for the most part, we're looking at historical trends, and then trying to figure out, identifying different SKUs or different items that we think have a lot of potential to grow in the market, and then setting targets to be able to sell beyond what a historical trend would dictate. I think, taking that a step further is, okay, so we've identified these items, and then, how do you build a sales plan to be able to develop that item and make sure that those sales come to fruition after that? Because you can make a bunch of plants, and if you don't have a way to get them out, then it all falls apart. So that's really the main thing is based on where the history has been, but also where we potentially see opportunity in the future.
Do you have any thoughts, John, on primary considerations for a forecast?
Yeah, actually, I like where David, where you started with that, because understanding the historical trends and then kind of looking at really the changes, and oftentimes that's where we try to focus people in, and looking at it, especially as you get through your growing season, you start thinking about the next season coming up. There's a lot of work in between the seasons that goes on, and so thinking about those changes that you kind of see in the future, and thinking about how are those going to impact future sales. We know historically what we've been able to do. What are some of those changes? And we can be talking about changes related to cost of production. So we've seen a lot the last couple of years about costs going up. We're starting to see some change in some of the input costs that are out there now, but we also see the same thing in terms of revenue, consumer demand. And so focusing on those changes, and kind of as you're forecasting the future, how does that maybe impact your approach to what you're going to look to do the next year is really an important aspect of just starting the overall forecasting process.
One other thing to add to that, John, I think that one of the things that you touched on was kind of having good information to be able to, I guess, build those types of ideas, whether that's consumer demand or whatever that is. Are there ways, I guess, that you see that make them, or where do you look for that type of information? Is that strictly in the sales space that you're finding that?
Sometimes, not strictly in the sales space. I would say some of it is related to forecasting and changes. Some of it's back to your cost of production, because at the end of the day, every business wants and needs to make a profit. and that profit's got to be able to cover other financial obligations, whether it's debt, family living, or even just reinvest in the business. So sometimes those changes are really looking at the that demand, or what the push is, maybe sometimes comes from an input side, and sometimes it can even be from outside of the area that you're working in. So for example, if you're buying fertilizers are always a great example, because it is highly correlated to natural gas, which is used in the production of fertilizer. And then also as you think about other types of crops, it's highly correlated to the price of corn, because people that raise field corn use so much nitrogen. Fertilizer tends to follow the direction of those two other price inputs. So sometimes you can look at the demand there and say, well, there's a high increase of demand from other places that's kind of having an impact on what we're going to have to do forecasting wise and some of those input costs. And then you kind of couple that with that sales information to start trying to get a good picture. Excellent question, because I think there's a lot of value in both. Good information out of sales is critical, but not understanding what's going on from the other places that also impact your operation, and could even impact sales too, to some degree. Looking at some of those outside factors and what influence they might have is another component in there.
Those are some really good, you guys brought up so many good points in the first few minutes. So I have a few things that I want to circle back to. I'd like to start with input costs, like production costs. You guys both touched on that. And I know there are a number of things that can fluctuate quite a bit from one season to another. I've just heard recently about the peat harvest in Canada, that it's not exactly, it hasn't been as dry as we would like it to be. So of course that'll affect prices and supply in the future. Another thing that can fluctuate quite a bit is fertilizer prices. So are there particular inputs that you guys can touch on and give examples of how those will affect your forecast and maybe what trends you're currently seeing?
Yeah, I can talk a little bit on the fertilizer side, that we've noticed that we've seen some drop off in the fertilizer prices. We're kind of seeing levels again, similar to what we were seeing a couple, like at least 2, maybe 3 years ago, where things are kind of on a downward trend. And it's a lot has to do with those kind of correlated markets that are out there. Natural gas prices have been not quite as high as what they've been. They're kind of on that seasonal kind of trend down we normally expect. The corn prices that are out there, they're the other factor. Those have been trending downward and still expected to maybe trend a little bit further down than what they are. So that all influences part of it. The other factor is also supply, was another area that was impacting fertilizer prices. From what I am understanding in some of the reports and articles that I've read, it looks like supply is not really quite the concern that it was a year ago. And I think supply is a really big part of the equation when you start looking at inputs. Fertilizer is a good example of that. If we don't really have a supply concern, at least in certain cases of items, especially if we're going to need large amounts of them, we can kind of forecast a little bit on what we expect those prices to kind of reach down to, kind of look at the market information that's out there, and give us a better idea of where some of those prices are maybe heading. We don't necessarily know where the level off point is going to be. We don't have that crystal ball for us, but at least get a good indication of where those trends are. In terms of some of the other inputs, David, some more specific to what you do, really into your industry, how do you look at some of those? What are some things you're noticing?
I mean, I think for us, I think so much of it is trying to plan ahead. I mean, I think, you talked about your crystal ball that you're trying to read into is, we joke that that's, what we're having to deal with. And in most cases is, the price may change. And so trying to be as proactive as possible to know, I guess, where that industry is going, or have a general sense of, to your point, Julie, the peat market or to the fertilizer. We were able to lock in a price for plastic costs before they shot up, which was amazing. So we were able to get some supply. It was, or at a certain price, but that didn't necessarily mean that we would get it when we asked for it. So there's things like that I think that, you can do if you can plan ahead. I know that some of the, at least with some of the distributors that we work with, they also have buying events where you can get things at a reduced rate. But as far as how that factors into our pricing, we try our best to build those models as with the information that we have, and to potentially even shoot a little higher that, okay, so if something goes wrong, or even with stock plants, so if our stock plants die because we had a cold winter, how are we going to offset that price because we had to buy them in instead? Because we've already lost money on the fact that they died in the winter, and we already had a lot of input money going into that, but now we have to turn around and buy it. So we maybe either have those plants either at a loss or maybe even break even, depending on where we can get them from. I think, those are some of the challenges that we've been facing recently, is how do you juggle some of that? Because I mean, some of it's, and some of it's out of your control. So is it on us to be able to make up that cost, or is that something, in some cases you can pass that along? I know our soil supplier has passed along a gas surcharge in some cases, or some things like that. And so that's one way that you can handle it. I think it's just having a really good idea of what you expect to pay, and then, certainly with overhead, and then having, some profit at the end of all of this is the goal. So just having a really good sense of what your costs are and being able to project for the next couple of years. I mean, that's something that we're working towards, is really having a good plan of, okay, so for the next 3 to 5 years, what does our projections look like? And can we say arbitrarily that costs will go up across the board 5%? And what does that look like? Because that's, even if we're wrong one way or the other, we're not as far off as we would hope. I hope. So it's really hard to project that and see, again, looking into the crystal ball. And I can't imagine being a tree grower doing the same thing, because you're looking at planting those trees and hoping in 3 to 5 years that those are the prices that you're putting in now are going to be the same or similar in the next few years. I mean, that certainly wasn't the case with fertilizer. So anyway, I hope that answers your question.
It does. Thank you. It's interesting hearing you guys talk about projections. It reminds me of an interview that I had with a different grower about a week ago. And he told me that as growers, there's no need to ever go to Vegas, because you're gambling every single day with your business.
Yeah.
It's just part of the job.
Yes.
That is accurate. That is accurate.
But it does sound like one way that you can improve the accuracy of your forecast is with historical data. I know, David, you mentioned that at the beginning. Could you talk more about the type of historical data that you collect and how that informs your forecast?
Yeah, so I guess right now we're looking at sales data, and I'll just pick, Panicum Shenandoah is a popular switchgrass that we grow. So we'll look at everything that we sold over the previous year. We'll break it down by, we grow size 18 pot, a 32 pot, and a 72 pot. And then we'll look at when those plants were sold, and then we'll compare that to what we forecasted. And so was that right? Was it wrong? Do we need to reevaluate our forecast? And hopefully that type of information will help us moving forward as well. And then, to John's point about the input, we do in some cases get certain varieties of plants from more than one source. So did it come out of the field, and do we get some tissue culture? And if that's the case, then do the costs line up for us to make sure that we sell everything, so that we are profitable in the end, because it all has to average out. I think that would be a question I actually have for you, John, about I guess how you guys work with, or how you would look at either overhead and, I guess identifying a certain number of units sold, because we do our projections based on a equivalence unit, which means that all of the pieces on the property are calculated down to a single unit, and then it's more complicated than that. But, is there a way to be able to look at that and I guess more accurately project costs to be able to attribute overhead and those types of things over that many units?
Yeah, actually, what you're talking about is very common to what we typically recommend for people to start thinking about it. Especially, I made a note that you mentioned you've got 140 grasses and sedges that you grow. So as you think about all the different types of product you're growing, whether it's different crops. One of the things that we really try to advocate for people is if you can take pretty good records of specific things that you did for certain crops, you can kind of allocate those expenses over to a certain segment. I like what you said about trying to kind of come down to an equivalent unit, because that's one of the struggle areas. If you sell things in a lot of different ways, you almost kind of have to come down to what's a common unit that you can use. You can break out from there if you want to get detailed once you've kind of got all the costs associated with that type of crop. And then you can start to look at, well, we've invested X amount of dollars in the entire crop. We have sold based on the different units. You can get into that level of detail if you've got that information. And it all comes down to how you're really tracking your financial records. And I always tell people, you can keep enough records to give yourself probably 5 to 10 full-time jobs. The main thing is tracking the information that you want to go back later and analyze. And we try to get people to think about doing what we call an enterprise analysis, where you look at every crop, or in cases, if you're selling things similarly, as would be in the case of some greenhouses, maybe it's you've got similar crops that really the difference is just the way the end product is sold. You can kind of group some of that stuff together and allocate those overhead costs across, figure out proportionally. A good example is like, you might have building insurance that you might have some of the utility costs that they're all sitting in the same building, or the same set of buildings, you just got a straight line on. You can kind of funnel those across and allocate based on which you think maybe had a little bit heavier use out of, some crops were in the building longer than maybe others, something like that. But the idea is to sit down and go through your expenses and first come up with that break even of what did that crop cost. And then you can bring in what you were talking about with what are the sales that we got out of that? How did that really, from a revenue standpoint, what did that bring into us? And you start to get a picture of which crops are the most profitable and which ones look like they have good potential, especially based on inventory. If you've got inventory that you're moving a lot of, well, that's really good indicator that people really have a high demand for that. So you can look at that and say, well, we have a really high demand for this. Are we making decent money off of this particular product? And then you can go the next step further, like in your case, where it's like, well, we sell it 3 different ways. Now let's look at where we're bringing in most of our money, where most of that inventory is moving, and you can kind of figure out from a forecasting standpoint, hey, this makes money, this is moving, this inventory is moving really well, and people really like it in this format or another format, and you can kind of figure out from that standpoint, maybe we ought to do a little bit more of that. Maybe switch where you maybe do less of one product setup, do more of another. And really what you're doing is what we call enterprise analysis, where you're trying to figure out, you're taking the whole of your business and you're breaking it up into the different pieces of where the expenses go to and where the income's coming from, to figure out what's making us money. And then circle back to all the other stuff we've already talked about, changes that are out there and, demand changes that are out there. But you at least get a really good idea of what's been working for us historically. Back to your point about trends, you do this over enough couple years, you've got your own internal trend analysis of what you've historically done, that you can look back and say, has this been a profitable venture for us? Or should we maybe think about shifting to something else that looks like a better opportunity? And I like you were talking earlier, you're looking into some new things that, green infrastructures, things like that, new opportunities that are out there, because you're doing that, David. That's the cool thing about all the stuff you're talking about. You're doing exactly what we're recommending people do, because that's how you maintain your business and how you keep it growing.
Yeah, I think one thing you pointed out, and I think that was a good, I guess, point to pull out, was that one, as far as, well, and I guess it's best practices, right? So one of the things was knowing the difference and recognizing it in your numbers to say what is a trend versus an aberration, basically. So, for instance, with what we do, we have a percentage of our business that's speculation, and you know, did I get a one-time landscape job that's never going to come back, that I had to make 50,000 plants for, or 10,000, or whatever that number is, and do I need to plan for it again in my sales projections for the following year? Probably not, but also what's realistic within those numbers.
Yeah.
So yeah.
No, that's a good way to look at it, because I think that's the unique thing about greenhouse and nursery area of production, is that you have cases like that where you try something new. I've got friends of mine that do a little bit of small scale sales, and we were just talking recently about they decided they raised mums, and they were trying a different type of mum, and they saw they had interest in it, and they said, well, we'll raise a little bit more of that, because we had, just to try it, because we had some people that really liked them. And but then they tried another variety that they did one time because somebody had asked for it, and said, well, we sold that, but nobody else really liked it, so we kind of went away from that and stuck more to the other ones that we see and have good information tells us to kind of keep pursuing in our sales.
When you guys are looking at historical data, how many years back do you think is enough to ensure an accurate forecast?
For us, I guess, and talking about aberrations or sort of changes within the data as far as anomalies in a lot of ways. The years through COVID were off in for a lot of people, I feel like, and so that's not going to be repeatable. For us, I guess at this point, would have been a 3 to 4 year average. I would say is probably now a 5 year average, because it's going to be higher. I just think it's going to be higher, but it's not going to be that high. So that's sort of where we've been looking at those numbers. It's hard with new products, but sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say I would agree with you. 5 years is a good number. It catches those shifts and trends pretty well. We have farms that we've worked with through MSU Extension that have got more than that. They've been doing the analysis for upwards of 10, 15 years or more. And some of that, you can see the aberrations in some of the stuff they do. But I think 5 years is a good number. And I think David's points are spot on. You kind of figure out, especially recently with COVID, it's a little tough. But go a little bit longer out in those cases. 3 years can be beneficial, especially if you're looking at kind of blips on the radar and you're trying to figure out, are we kind of looking at a trend in one direction? You could maybe narrow it down from your 5 to your 3, depending what's going on. But I think 5's generally what we typically recommend for people, just to kind of have enough history to say you've got some times that are maybe similar to what you're in now, but you're also accounting for maybe those upward or downward swings in the trends.
You guys had also mentioned skews or anomalies. Of course, one of those might be effects from COVID. So do you have any other examples for how to figure out in a forecast or in historical data what might have been skewed, and how to remove any dirty data, if we might call it that, from your future forecasts?
For us, it's always looking at the different breakdowns of certain SKUs or units. So if we knew that, for instance, one customer has a new program and they want to put together that with a certain size, and then we fulfill that order, and then they come back and say that didn't sell well, we want to go back to what we were doing. That is typically those type. We have to, I guess, use contextual data in that sense to be able to fulfill some of the gaps that the numbers wouldn't. They may point us to a potential issue, but they may not give the full story.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would say that's a good case of where, when you think about, especially in COVID, we had a lot of a lot of different things going on there. We had supply chain interruptions. We had consumers that were looking for different ways to buy things, and so your supply and your demand saw significant shifts. A lot of cases, when you're kind of coming out of those odd times, is what we like to refer anymore to the COVID-19 years, is I think that's a case where, in David's example of talking to people that they were selling to, I think having a little bit more direct conversation with some of your customers and getting a feel for people that buy from you, what maybe they're expecting, especially from a forecasting of what's going to sell, you can get an idea of where that demand side maybe is, and start to think about, are we back to kind of maybe where we were um, before COVID, using that as an example, or are we still kind of in the midst where there's still some disruptions? Because we saw some of that in some of the sales. We saw a lot more local sales versus maybe like in the grocery industry, they saw a lot more uh, local small sales, direct sales for a lot of products because of the shift away from being able to get into a grocery store with all the shutdown. But then we started to notice where things started to change again, where people started to kind of frequent some of those areas again. And as you kind of get a feel talking to your consumers and what they're looking for, you can get a feel for where that demand shift is heading. And I think that's really important, because in a lot of cases you're the supply side in terms of what they're going to buy, but then you've got that information to then go back and say, okay, I have an idea where my demand's going to be. I can forecast maybe some on the revenue side of what to expect for sales. Now I can go back and look at the other factors of, the costs that are involved to get the product to them, and start giving yourself some realistic projections of where exactly are we at, and where do we think we're going to be? Is this a short term, long term? Some of it's speculation. I think David really hit on that really well. That there's a little bit of element of estimation in all this. That you know, uh, I like the description you gave, David, about you kind of plan ahead. If things go one way or go the other way, you're a little bit prepared in case that shift you know doesn't happen right away, or maybe it's a short-term shift. But I think getting a better information on the demand side and talking to your customer base is really good place to start, because that gives you a big piece of the puzzle, and then you can start to filter in the rest.
David, did you have anything to add? I didn't want to leave you out.
No, I think that he summed it up.
Okay,
Thank you.
great. Another topic that I wanted to move into was how growers can collect data. I know that a lot of growers are looking at different autonomous methods that are kind of connected to their environmental control systems or their accounting software. And others are looking at, pen and paper, spreadsheets, having workers in those departments. So are there pros and cons to each side? Which ones, would you guys recommend? I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I guess the my first thought is, like, it depends on what you've got available, and what information you're looking to track. It kind of goes back to a little bit of what I was talking about earlier, where you can track a lot of different things, but if you're not going to use it, then it's really not worth tracking. And so it depends really what you're trying to get information on, because sometimes paper and pencil works great. It actually can work great even with more computerized software, and even apps on the phone that you can actually combine, where you maybe need to jot some details down that you can later input in there. And so I think a lot of it pertains to what you're trying to get to. I know people that have got really sophisticated tracking information, that they're capturing all this data. We see it all the time, and a lot of the equipment that's out there. We have all this data information we can capture, and if you're gonna use it, it's great. But if you're really not gonna use it, I would kind of steer people away from saying that's a necessity,
Mhm.
unless they're willing to look into on the idea of, maybe we could find a use for it because we've maybe never used it before. Maybe it's a new thing we can try out that gives us some better details. And I see David shaking his head. So I'm kind of curious if that's kind of the stuff they've gone through, but that's kind of the way I usually approach it with people, is to think of it that way. David, how do you folks approach it?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've over collected data in the past, and we've, sort of shifted away in some cases. It just kind of depends on what it is. I mean, I think, you made a great point about usable data. And I think if you're trying to establish a historical trend, and maybe that new technology or something is going to help you get to that trend and establish it, then great. Because if you don't have information, you can't really make trends in the future. But if you're going to invest in it, you have to make sure that you do use it. Otherwise, what's the point of that investment? Because you're going to go through and either build something to track it, and then that's a waste that sits on the bookshelf that you never use again, or yeah, otherwise it's just a waste of expense. So, or somebody's time. And so I think, that's a really, really important point. I mean, I think for us, we have, again, good historical data, especially from the sales side. And we've got a gentleman here who's exceptional at pulling reports together and good information, and being able to both form it in a way that, we can really understand it, but also look at it and say, I think we can do better in this space, and sort of seize the future of some of these reports. So I think that's, for us, that's been certainly he's a good guy to have on your team. But I think too, even if you don't have, I guess for us, a lot of experience. Well, let me back up. When we started out, we didn't have a lot of information. And so trying to identify and prioritize which of the information is going to give you the best results is something that I think you should do if you're starting out fresh. We've gone from pen and paper to computers and Excel sheets to ERP systems to now more sophisticated ERP systems over time. And each one comes with its own complications and its own limitations, and more specialized team to be able to operate it. So I think that, yeah, you can jump right into an ERP system, enterprise resource planning system, but you will have a huge uphill battle if you don't know, for one, what that is. But being able to start with something like that is really difficult. So we, going from just even Excel sheets and doing calculations and formulas, and having a good understanding of how all of that works, and continuing to build on that foundation of data and information to be able to jump into that eventually, is going to be huge. Because if you don't understand what that system can do from a fundamental level, it's not going to give you the information that you really need in the end to make good decisions. Because if you're making these decisions off of fallacies in your data, or you're looking at the data incorrectly, then all of your projections are going to be all of your costing information, and your business model won't work in the end. So I think that's, having good data that's usable is really important, especially with the amount of time that we spend collecting this information.
David, one thing you mentioned is that maybe in the past Hoffman had collected a little bit more data than you guys needed. Can you talk more about maybe what you decided to prioritize and why?
Yeah, I mean, I think, for instance, we did hourly planning for some of our employees. And so we knew that, these employees were doing these jobs over, every day. These employees were doing this, and then these employees were doing this. And it, in the end of the year, we could go back and say, okay, their time was divided up this way, and this is where they were spending most of their time. That information is great, but at the end of the year, if either myself or a manager didn't use it, then it was all for naught. So it's really, those are the types of information that it was great. It's good to have, but if we're not going to use it at the end of the year, it is kind of a waste of time. And so I had certain managers on our team, and we actually just recently stopped doing this. But it was a huge time sink. And so some managers were spending a couple hours a week putting in information into the system. And now that we've stopped doing this, they all of a sudden have, 2 more weeks a year where they can be doing stuff. So it's a substantial amount of time that they can gain just by either collecting the right information. I mean, they know where the problems are within their department if they're a good manager. So I think that that's too, they need to be targeting those and doing, whether it's a lean flow exercise or a Six Sigma exercise, to actually hone in on that, do a quick time study to know, okay, you take your pen and paper, to John's point, take your pen and paper, run the numbers on how long it takes to pot a tray, and then, make a model out of that and get some information, and then do that semi-regularly, so that you're not having to go through and collect it every day. You're collecting it once a month, or you're collecting it, a couple times a quarter maybe, and from that you can extrapolate more information that maybe doesn't take as long to actually empower your people. So, but yeah, I think from a prioritization perspective, I think really, ROI is great. I was talking with a Dutch guy one time, and he was telling me that, we're so focused on our ROI and a 3-year ROI, but aren't we going to be around in 5 or 10 years? And so some of it's about getting the job done, and it might be a little bit longer of an ROI for some of those types of things. But, for us, especially in our business that's so labor intensive, it's really important to be able to, make good decisions about where we can save money in the end. So I don't know if that answered your question, but I think.
Yeah, it did. Thank you. Is that the ROI that growers typically go with for forecasting, about 3 years?
That's what we hear from our bank and people like that, as far as when you're getting a loan, or it has been. I think it depends on what piece of equipment it is and what they expect, and those types of things. But yeah, I continuously hear 3 years is kind of the number. So I don't know, John, you might have a different number for that.
Well, I think you're spot on. I think it depends a lot on what they're looking at. 3 is usually a good number. Three seems to be kind of the number for a lot of things in the lending world. They want 3 years worth of history. They want 3 years worth of outlook, depending on what it is you're looking at, especially if they've got a lot of invested in the operation. And so I think that's a big key. And I just want to echo, I think you were spot on with what you're talking about in terms of how to prioritize that information, because what you brought up there, and this is what, again, when you're looking at ROIs and thinking about, looking into the future, especially if you're having a conversation with a lender, being able to isolate the information that either confirms what you're looking for, or you think you kind of know, or in some ways helps you to identify the stuff you don't know, is a great way to prioritize. And I heard you that's kind of what your examples were floating around, that basic concept of what's going to make us better, help us in our decision making. And I think a 3-year outlook is you're kind of projecting, if you can use data to tie it into your forecasting and thinking about how can we continually improve this, is all great information in there.
Yeah, and I think, to your point, I think it's, trying to figure out what's useful, good data that's worth prioritizing versus what's just noise, and what are you going to get lost in, and what are you going to, follow a rabbit hole down that maybe you shouldn't have.
Yes, there are a good number of rabbit holes that we can all dive into at some point.
Yeah.
Well, we do have about 4 minutes until we're going to move into the Q&A section of the webinar. So the last question that I wanted to pose to you guys is, what trends are you seeing in consumer demand that may be affecting your future forecasting? For example, I've seen a lot about houseplants recently, that COVID kind of brought back the resurgence of houseplants, and that's on a lot of growers' minds when they're looking at their production plans.
Yeah, I think for us, we see a lot of folks talking about native plants. We see, there's something else that I forgot. I guess the other thing that we're looking at too is green infrastructure. And so what are good opportunities for anywhere within that space? So are there new plants that people don't really talk about? Are there, is it at any part of the water system, anything from sitting in water up to the edges of them? So thinking through that, meadows, all of those types of subspaces is kind of where we're seeing a lot of interest, and I think there's an emerging market there that there's a lot of opportunity for people, whether you're installing or growing or anything.
I'm not so sure in terms of trends and in terms of the various areas of nursery and greenhouses. One of my colleagues at MSU Extension could answer that question a little bit better than I can. I do think there is something to the houseplant part of it, though, because my wife has acquired several more houseplants since we moved in a couple years ago. So that might be part of the explanation on that part of it.
She's following the trend.
Yep.
I have a few myself. I have a good number of succulents and some monstera in my apartment that they've happily made themselves at home.
I'm guilty too.
I think that's all for our discussion questions. Wendy, if you'd like to look in the Q&A, I think we've got some great audience questions to go over.
We do. I'm not sure which one to cover first. Let's see. I've got one that's from someone starting out. As someone starting out, I have no history. So how can a grower find data on what to grow?
My number one recommendation for anyone looking to get started, especially if you're looking for any kind of data out there, one of the things that we don't spend enough time talking about is mentorship and getting to know other growers that are in the business. Because a lot of cases when we go to project, we're looking for that silver bullet of information on what the costs are going to be and what to forecast. And I think for someone starting out, getting to know the other folks that are kind of already in the business you're looking to get into can help you get an idea of what some of those trends are. And every operation is a little different in terms of sharing financial information. So I wouldn't necessarily say expect that. But one of the neat things about being involved in the production world is that every person that's out there in production likes to see other people be successful, and especially new people getting started. There's always a huge interest for people to see new operations get started and having more kind of part of that community. So I'd say start there is really a good place because they can start to give you an idea of what some of the things to expect. They're great for having advisors and people to kind of bounce ideas off of and think through some of the numbers. The other aspect is talking to people that focus on the production. Like I mentioned, we've got educators that actually focus on greenhouse or nursery areas. They can be a great source of information on what's maybe realistic based on what they're seeing in conversation with producers or out in the markets. And I'd say starting to collect that resource of people that can help you start to get a feel for what the industry is like and what those trends maybe are is a really good place to start figuring out your own numbers.
We have another one. It's a little long, but I think it's a pretty cool question. When I think of forecasting, I think of crop production, planning, and crop forecasting. It seems to me that most farmers are using Excel spreadsheets for crop planning. Are there any crop planning software tools out there suitable for flowers and so fruit, etc., needing reliable production volumes? Or are spreadsheets and farm design systems still the only way to go due to complexity in specific circumstances?
David, do you have a software that you use, or how?
I'm interested in the answer to this.
I think there's more and more crop production planning softwares coming out. I know we currently are in Microsoft Dynamics and Agriware, which is a company based out of, well, Microsoft Dynamics, I'm sure you're familiar with that, but Agriware is produced by Emprise. They're based out of Holland. That seems to be a pretty good system. I know there's a new system from Qualitree out in Canada, in British Columbia. They have a new crop planning. These are more ERP type systems. I mean, I know there's some smaller systems out there, and it kind of depends on what you want the system to do and how comprehensive you want it to be. When we went with an ERP system, we made the decision that we wanted it to do be as comprehensible as it can all under one roof, because we needed the finances to talk to the production, to know the costing, to be able to tie everything together. But I can tell you, before we got into that, I had 5, 6 different systems that we were all running simultaneously. That one was a CRM, one was our Excel, which was production planning, and one was sales numbers, and then we had, and then. I mean, it just kind of depends on what you're trying to do, at least from what we've done. And I think it's a size thing too for your organization, and how big of an organization are you, and what are you trying to manage? I mean, I know some, up to $30 million companies that are using, small ERP systems. And I know, $5 to $10 million companies that are using Excel. So, I mean, I think it depends on what you're trying to do with it. I mean, having somebody that can understand that information is, I think, something that's going to make or break some of these systems, because you really have to have good people on your team that can analyze that and know what's noise in the data.
We have some various production type Excel tools out there at FSU that are kind of, we've got a couple that are, one kind of for greenhouses, one for nursery, and they're kind of designed to have multiple different types of crops, but it's very much a production based. But I think what you said, David, is really spot on to what I'm aware of. It really depends on what you're trying to do, because Excel can be a wonderful tool. It's very versatile, but it also has its limitations. So depending on what you're trying to accomplish, it may not be the right fit for what you're trying to do, which may be the case of the person asking the question here, that they're looking for something a little bit more advanced to do some other things. But for, especially earlier with a question for someone starting out, Excel might be a great place to start. And kind of figure out exactly what it is you need as you progress up. But I'm not as familiar with some of the software stuff out there, so that's why I kind of leaned on David to kind of fill us in on that one.
Well, I think another thing too is, I think everybody starts out in a software, and I think the transition really is getting into databases, because that's the powerhouse of some of the capabilities that the spreadsheets just don't have that capability of, because then you can manipulate the data to be able to view it in different ways depending on how you're using it. And so I'm not as familiar with some of those systems. I just know that they exist and that you can get a lot of information out of them. But I know that that's sort of the natural progression from my understanding of other folks that I've talked to.
We've got what 2 more we can ask. One is, how do you anticipate cost increases when you're planning so far in advance? I think we kind of covered some of that.
Yeah, and I think for us too, and it's, especially when you're looking at, I guess our, when we're projecting, so we're setting our forecasts a year and a half or a year from when we're trying to actually sell those plants, because we have to be almost 2 years out to know exactly what plants we really want to sell to be able to put them in the ground. So I think it's difficult to know exactly how some of those costs may change over time. But I think, sort of one of the things that we talked about earlier was just, having a built-in amount of how your costs of goods will go up over time. So if that's 5%, and that's a reasonable average, and then, you plan on that. And if it's only 3, or if it's only 4, then you're good. If it's at 6, then where else can you cut?
Okay. Then I've got a fun one for starting with, for David, biggest mistake you've made in forecasting and what you learned from it. You don't have to answer that if you don't want
to. I'm sure there are several.
You can say none.
Oh, there's none. Yeah, I forecast I will make one then. Yeah, I think, I mean, for us, it's, we've put plants in the ground late, and haven't adjusted what we expected to get out of those mother plants. I mean, I think that was a big mistake, where we could have, that could have been a lot worse. And, we certainly had to spend more money to be able to make the plants that we needed to make. But I think that was definitely something that we've done. I don't know if that's the biggest. We've oversold plants. That was a forecasting mistake. So we promised that we can produce 50,000 and the crop just didn't grow the way we expected. And so that's embarrassing, having to call your customers back and say, well, sorry, suppliers don't deliver. Sometimes that also affects that. Yeah, I think there's several of those types of things I think that definitely happen. And to that, it's both on the sales side and the prediction side. And looking into that crystal ball that John has, that he's probably got right behind him.
Yeah, it sounds like John
Is-
does.
That's
And
right.
that goes hand in hand with the biggest mistake you see growers make, John. And then we're going to ask something positive to close out.
Well, actually, one of the things that David mentioned early on in the talk that I was really happy to hear that he said that they do is I often see people, they make projections, but then they don't actually go back and look at the actual numbers to see how did the two compare. Because there's a lot of valuable information that you can take away from comparing what actually happened to what you thought was going to happen. Because there's a lot of things that happen, and David just gave some great examples of some things that can kind of go wrong. But there's also cases where things can go right, and
That was my
things
next
turn out.
question.
Like what things. Well, in some cases, what did you do that you want to do again next year because it
Mhm.
really paid off, and you miss that because you're just saying, hey, we made more money than we thought we were going to. Great. But if you don't go back and actually compare, what was the factor that led to that? Maybe it was pricing was better. Maybe it was production was better. Or maybe you made some production decisions that actually cut back costs. You tried something new, either out of chance or out of necessity, and you start to analyze what the numbers can tell you a lot about the actual practices and the production decisions you make. And oftentimes people say, that projection, I wrote it, it's a year old, it's valueless. We're just going to move on to next year. And I think looking backwards gives us a lot of valuable information. And that's probably the biggest mistake I see a lot of producers make is they don't go back to say, how did things turn out? Why did they turn out that way? And just comparing actual to projection gives you a lot of great information.
Okay, I guess we'll just close out with what are in just a few words from each of you, best practices or advice you'd give growers for successful forecasting? And a
John,
few
you wanna
words,
start?
and like but it's like in a haiku.
I would say, plan as much as you can, I guess. And then, like John just said, check your plan, make sure that it was what you expected and check your data.
Okay, great. John?
Uh, the time involved is a lot to do some of this, but it's worth it. Spend the time. It will make you and your business way better off than if you didn't spend the time to do it.
Okay, great. Well, we have to wrap up. Thanks for all the questions to everyone who sent them in. Hopefully we caught some of them. We'll be posting this and that concludes our conversation about forecasting in our first installment of the Greenhouse Grower Executive Series. I'd like to thank David and John very, very much for sharing your expertise with us this afternoon. And thanks to everyone else who joined us today. We hope to see you again in October for our next installment. So stay tuned for that. And the topic, we'll be sharing that on our website and social media. So look out for that via emails. But massive thanks to John and David, both of you. This is tremendous.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming, and please enjoy the rest of your week.